Okay, just waiting for, oh, yeah, we are live. Awesome. So, welcome. I'm Jacob McGill. I'm the founder of the 100-Year Plan, and I'm here to help you live longer, healthier, and happier with the quality of life that you deserve. Now, that's a fundamental principle of the 100-Year Plan itself. But today, we're here to talk about one of my favorite triangles. There are 56 triangles in the 100-Year Plan. And the format that I'm using for presenting the triangles to you is a curriculum that I was gifted by some friends. And it's called The Most Important Conversations. That's the TMIC part that you see. Now, there's something very important you need to understand about this version. We're not having the conversation. Okay, this is just a monologue, not a dialogue. I really enjoy the dialogues, and the format that this usually occurs in is, instead of receiving one entire triangle today, we unpack the triangles one corner at a time in a 3-week process. So we can dig in for 20 to 30 minutes on the concepts and principles, and then spend the next hour or so unpacking it. Because the job here is to really empower you. And that empowerment takes a little bit of work. You got to work on your inner game, your mentality, your relationship, the ontological sweat that is required to shift your perspective and relationships to things. So you're getting a third of the package right now. And I just want to be transparent about that up front. But that being said, let's dig in. Welcome, first off. Secondly, thank you for being here. And lastly, to start repeating myself a bit, we're here today to talk about open, align, and strengthen. So those are the components of this particular triangle. And the 100-Year Plan is based on these systems. I built these principles together because when I was in my learning phase, which is before the lab phase, when I was taking in information, I was being drawn and quartered, to be honest. It's kind of being pulled apart. Because I was hanging out with fantastic people, like experts in the different modalities. And these experts, in and of themselves, like my teachers and my mentors, they were great. But the communities that gathered around them, which is a normal piece of humanity. I actually talk to my friends about this all the time, and I warn them about these things. I say, beware of the bottom 20%, and they'll take something and turn it into a bit of a religion. Now, what do I mean by that? Osteopathic work combined with Pilates saved my life in terms of my structural well-being, right? It wasn't one thing. It was the leverage of these multiple modalities. And like I said, my mentors, my teachers, the people at the top, although they were an expert in their thing, they understood this. But some of this bottom 20% people would be like, oh, Pilates is great, and that's crap. Osteopathy is great, and that's crap. And, that isn't true. Crap is crap. You can find crappy things in any modality. You could find great things in any modality. But the idea that you get religious about one way of doing things and discard all others doesn't make any sense. So I started looking at this stuff, and I was like, how do I systematize these things, these principles, these concepts, these practices around facts? And ironically, that was always right in front of me. It's the organism. Okay? Generally speaking, we all have 2 feet and they face forward. Okay? We all have 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 ears, 2 arms. The shoulder is on the front of the body, not the side. Our shoulder blades are all built the same way. Our posture might be different, but one of the things we're going to discuss today is the more you get your posture closer to an ideal alignment, the more functional it is, and therefore the less pain you're in, as an example. And so what I was able to do was start developing this thing that I called a fact-based practice. Right? Everybody's lungs are pretty much in the same place. Everybody's knees are pretty much in the same place, right? Your knee happens to be kind of halfway between your hip and your ankle, right? And if it's not, you're probably in trouble. So once we start relying on these physiological, anatomical, biological, even psychological in some way, facts, it gives us a reliable system. And that's what started to make sense for me, because each of these modalities is meant to serve the organism, not the modality. And so that's what I mean when I was saying religious earlier, right? Because like getting religious about modality is, again, this thing's great and other stuff is shit. Like it kind of forgets serving the person who that modality is supposed to help in the first place. So that's how I started to clear this stuff up. And the triangle works really well for another reason, and that's physics. When you take the triangle and you have a problem, you need leverage. Most of the time, the answer is leverage. And so the way to create leverage with an equilateral triangle is you take one face and you break the corner off, and you have a fulcrum, the leverage. And so I mean this quite literally. So what we're going to talk about today in the open, align, strengthen is one of the primary triangles for pain relief, for rehabilitation, and really for finding your most functional way of being in terms of movement by addressing the biomechanics of movement. So this isn't going to be all pain. If you have a splinter in your eye, like please go to the emergency room. But if your shoulder bugs you, if your hip is annoying, if your knee nags you, if your ankle tweaks once in a while, or you wake up with calf cramps in the middle of the night, these are all symptoms of alignment. And one of the most interesting things about alignment issues, you're going to hear me say this a lot, and this is published research. 98% of pain is the site of a compensation pattern, not an injury. So in a case like mine, I am a 1%er. My car accident was a catastrophic failure. That's a 1%. And then there's some people who have a pathological failure, and that's another 1%. But the rest of the population, right? Those people are like, oh, my back. Generally speaking, it's not your back, okay? It's like you're feeling it in your back, and this hip is out, and that knee is out, and that ankle's out. And when I work with clients, you kind of end up doing this forensic thing. I think about it when you watch the movies of them like brushing away the sand off the dinosaur bone. And it's like, yeah, they're doing that, but somebody had to get in there with like a grater or backhoe and peel off like 5 feet of soil first. And then another guy came in with a shovel. And then they got into like softer and softer and softer tools the closer they got to the fossils. And yeah, they're using a little like paintbrush or camera brush at the end because of this delicate thing. But they had to remove a lot of dirt, right? And that's the dig. And so working with clients, that's where we get to these things where they're like, oh yeah, right, like my 15-year-old ankle injury that they didn't even think about when they came in with their sore back. And honestly, like 3 to 6 months of working with them before they're like, right, I totally forgotten about that. And that's very normal and very human. But these are the layers that compound, and these malalignments kind of all build one on top of each other until you end up in this house of cards scenario. But theory aside, the question is, what is it we need to do to free you up, to reverse that, and to get to pain-free, right? Like that's the whole point of this conversation. How can you benefit from it? So let's have a sip of water and dig into that. So This piece was handed directly to me. I didn't invent it or think of it. I drew it onto a triangle. But this was taught to me right in the beginning. And, credit to Diane Miller, one of several brilliant Pilates teachers I've studied with. And she's one of the people that really taught me to systematize the process. And she taught a lot of biomechanical, again, facts, right? This is how a body moves, and this is how Pilates relates to it, which was wonderful because we learned functional movement first and Pilates second, right? Pilates is just a pathway to restoring functional movement. And I've been trained to think that way. And I owe it to her specifically. So she would say this. She'd say, you first have to open the joints. After you open the joints, then you can align the structure. Once you have structural alignment, only then can and should you strengthen. Now, we need to unpack these things. So let's start with that. What is opening the joints? Or more importantly, what is a closed joint? Let's take something simple for a second. So physiologically speaking, the knee is essentially a hinge, right? Just kind of like the elbow, but the knee is different in one very specific way. And there's a bunch of different ways, but this particular thing is that once your leg gets straight, your knee joint opens. And if you over straighten or get into hyperextension, you're actually going to close the joint. Now, this happens to be very important because an open knee joint is a good thing. You have this cartilage in there. It's the cartilage on the thigh bone and the cartilage on the shin bone, okay? And that stuff is supposed to slide and glide. Cartilage is articulating tissue, not weight loading tissue. So if you're functional, and when you straighten the leg, the knee joint opens, and that's when you weight load, awesome. And if you're not, and you weight load on that closed joint, you're going to weight load on the cartilage. And eventually, you do that enough times, often enough, long enough, because it's not designed for weight, you're going to grind it away. Now, on the way to grinding it away, because the body is pretty damn smart, it will send you warning signals. It'll send you pain and other sorts of information. And one of the things it'll do to try and protect that joint is close it. And everybody who's had a sprain has noticed this because a sprain falls along a similar pattern. It is essentially a fear reflex, right? Here is my joint mobility for my wrist. And this is my range of motion of that wrist. And this is my flexibility, okay? They're different things. But if I fall on my hand, I'm going to put weight into that and I'm going to take it too far too fast. Now, if it's too far and too fast, I might break something, but that's not a sprain. That's a break. A sprain is, I'm scared, don't do that again. And it may be strong enough to break a few blood vessels, put that fear patterning in there. And one of the things you'll notice is that the sprained wrist definitely doesn't want to go back into that position again. Feels threatened and vulnerable to do that. And it's going to immobilize itself. And that's how our body protects itself. This is one of the things that joint systems will do. And we even have a label for it, a sprain. And this joint tells me, like, don't put any weight on me, don't move me. And it sends pain signals. What's it doing to protect itself? Closing the joint. Now, if I don't open that joint, right, it's going to be sitting a little funny, probably out of alignment. And that's not a pattern I want to strengthen. I don't want to get good at that. I don't want to have it turn into normal. And I certainly don't want to become somebody who can do really strong, incredible bicep curls with that messed up wrist position, because it's going to pass stress up the rest of the system. And this is where that compensation pattern information and theory starts to come into practice, right? If I take that sprained wrist and I don't restore it to its optimal state, if it stays crooked, and then I continue to strengthen, that's going to pass malfunction and load up to the elbow. And that's going to pass malfunction and load up into the shoulder. And if I'm really unintelligent about it and I put way more weight than I should into it, I'm going to end up strengthening this, which is kind of a messed up shoulder thing. And then I try to do anything above my head and I'm loading into a completely dysfunctional joint. And again, with that timeline I described earlier, like 5, 10, 15 years later, I've forgotten about the wrist and my shoulder hurts. And this is how stuff gets passed up, down through kinetic chains, because our bodies are incredibly intelligent and they're trying to spread stress out throughout the system all the time. Like this is innate in us. It's part of the things that have made our species so successful. Our ability to normalize things really quickly, environmental changes, weather changes, whatever, these things, be like, oh, okay, it used to be that way, but now it's this way. That's adaptation. And then coupled with that, the ability to just kind of take something and live with it, right? And you see animals do that all the time too. Like that sore paw just stays off the ground and the dog will figure out how to run. And like that's a dog with a sore paw. We've all seen a 3-legged dog as well, as functional, right? Incredible in how they just can like normalize, adapt, and keep going. So this is innate to a lot of species, but we psychologically do this as well. Anyway, opening the joints is the first step to restoring function. Because again, as I just went through this, a closed joint has to pass dysfunction or stress through other parts of the system, right? Because it just can't function optimally. That's the thing about alignment. Now, speaking about alignment, opening this joint, right, does not guarantee a restoration of function. Opening it and then working to work in alignment, repatterning the movement in alignment is the thing. And this is one of the other super important principles that was taught to me. The body learns through movement. So this is where we have some dysfunction in our thinking, and that is sit up straight. Like why, how, for how long, what does that even mean? And so another thing that you're going to hear me say quite continuously is that posture is actually dynamic. So you can sit up straight, but you're not a statue, and you're not an artist model. You need to move. So if you are sitting, then you can at least bring in, as we talked about last time, the movement of 21 muscles, 20 of which are postural muscles, simply by sitting and breathing fully. You're bringing movement into your sitting. Now, is this as healthy as, say, the postural reset movements that we've been doing in the movement days? Well, no, this is way more optimal. Why? Because I'm moving in the 3 planes, and then I can return to a better posture that I can breathe into. So that's some of the data gathering process between the 2 different planes of movement, the 2 different sides of the body, and the 6 axes that we have that give me the opportunity to reset my posture. Because in the world of sitting, we have really like 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, like I can produce a textbook spine, the 3 curves where they should be. 5 vertebrae in the lumbar, 12 vertebrae in the thoracic, 7 in the cervical, and boy, oh boy, does my spine look good in an x-ray or from across the street. What a nice spine. And 10 to 15 minutes of sitting, that's going to have to change. I'm going to have to like slouch back, slouch forward, do something. If for no other reason than my lower brainstem is like, oh, he's sitting on his sits bones and circulation is starting to stop because all that weight is sitting there. And this guy's going to get gangrene and rot to death, right? And it just wants circulation to come back. So it's going to move you off of sitting anyway. And so that's where the idea of sitting is slightly dysfunctional. We're not actually meant to do it. We're meant to squat, we're meant to run, we're meant to walk, and we're meant to lie down. That's actually how we were built and evolved, right? We've been around for a lot longer than chairs. So that little bit of a tangent aside, and the fact that we live, breathe, and move dynamically should remind you that since the body learns through movement, if you want to change your alignment, you need to move, and you need to do it frequently. And the best type of movement is the type of movement that loads either side of a joint in a healthy manner so that you're opening that joint, you're restoring functional movement. Now, in the case of this elbow bend, which could also be a bicep curl, if I put too much load in, I'm going to close this joint or this joint to try and get leverage to move that weight. That's too much for me to move in a healthy manner. And so too much load can be another reason for closing joints, which happens a lot in some forms of exercise, especially exercising to failure. So I'm not entirely against that, but the kind of activities you use to restore yourself after that really matter if you're going to stress the system out and rep to absolute failure. And, you know, they'll have signs up at every gym about like, don't drop the weights. And I'm not suggesting that you do, but you can see why that might actually be somewhat more intelligent than repping to failure, putting the system in a bad place, and then finishing that rep in a really ugly position. Because the other thing that's interesting about the brain body is that it tends to remember the last rep, not the third or the fifth, like that one where things were great. But again, those last few are where the programming starts to come from. So you want to open the joints and get into alignment, and then you want to work and move in alignment. Crazily enough, you want to move and breathe in alignment, either reaching towards alignment, restoring function one little piece at a time because somebody's helping you work where you're out of alignment and realign one joint and then the next joint and then the next joint, and then combine two joints and then combine two joints, and then use all three, which would be an entire limb movement: wrist, elbow, shoulder, ankle, knee, hip. But a lot of people shouldn't be strengthening all three joints at once because you're not aligned in all three joints. Right? And so that's where the ability of somebody to help you break the pieces down and see where the malalignments are, work to strengthen by opening and aligning first, and then patterning the place where you're weak, the joint that's out of alignment. And again, things get passed through the system. Remember that 98% of pain thing. So that knee pain might not be bad knee alignment. It might be poor ankle foot alignment, which loads the knee, which feels knee pain. And so you need to correct all three joints, right? Top and bottom of the knee, top ankle, lower ankle, foot, and come at those three joints from these 5 different perspectives. This stuff is super important for restoring function. Now, from there, once you have alignment, you can move into strengthening. And strengthening is very straightforward. There are essentially 3 types of strengthening. Okay, there's the wiring and the firing, where you're actually just creating a pathway. You see babies doing this a lot of the time, although it's a lot more jerky and sporadic, but they're carving pathways for the first time. That's why you don't give them like a fork. Now, repetition is the second way of carving that pathway. And then, of course, the third type is load. And this is where I kind of fell in love with Pilates specifically, because with springs, you have a lot of nuance in those first two stages in the way that you can create and carve these pathways, because you get a very diverse amount of resistance that you can channel in there. And because you can dial that resistance into these movements so intelligently, you can really fast track this carving or these recreation of movement pathways and work in alignment with something called a closed kinetic chain, touching an object or feeling that resistance really early on. Now, this can also be accomplished like on your own with other forms of resistance like elastics and tubes and bands and all that sort of stuff. And so that's where the value of some of that work can come in as well, because again, it can be used to train you to connect and restore in a functional movement capacity, especially if you're really thinking like, I'm not just doing arm curls against a rubber band, but how is my posture related to that, right? If I'm doing it standing, is my weight on front two, little toe, big toe, ball of the foot, inside, outside heel, cupped, lifted arches, feeling the inner thigh, the kinetic chain all the way up into that pelvic floor so that that posture can sit on top of it. So all of those pieces, right? Every single story of the building is lined up together. And again, we kind of talked about this a little bit in the past. This is going to be an ongoing concept and a major principle of all these conversations: proprioception. Okay, one of your nervous systems, the proprioceptive nervous system, is the one that helps you learn where alignment is, feeling where your body is in space, and then from there, knowing how you want to relate it to the movement that you're doing and to the load that you're experiencing, so that you can feel if you're in place or if you're slipping out, whether it's fatigue, whether it's load, whether it's too complicated. There are a bunch of different factors that you can back off on a little bit to make your movement more functional, to make your strength more purposeful and something that's building your future, right? Taking you forward into longevity as far as your movement is concerned, because it's supporting your function, it's supporting your posture, and it's coming from a commitment to alignment. So that kind of weaves the pieces together for today. Again, you must open first. Diane's words, I believe them, like they're one of my religions, but open the joints first, align the structure second, and only then third do you strengthen. And then the strengthening is very much a protocol thing of carve the movement pathway first, and then deepen that carve through a certain amount of repetition, and then gradually introduce load first through a closed kinetic chain, working with an object other than the body, and then secondarily from there, safely and appropriately, increasing load. And you'll see this stuff everywhere, right? The kettlebell guys, especially like the Russian schools and stuff, like they're all about one-arm push-ups, but they will make you practice for a long time doing perfect technique ones against a wall, right? Can you do 100 or 200 reps? Okay, now go to a countertop, right? And they work their way into a standard plank push-up on the floor. But if you watch them pull those off, one-arm push-ups, they're not twisted, they're not cranked, they're not in this weird, awkward position that's loading the shoulder bad and putting tension into the back and pressuring the spine. They look exactly like a two-arm push-up. They just happen to have one arm touching the floor. That's alignment. That's that process. It's kind of a textbook version of it and how they agree with these principles. So I hope that makes sense. And just so you know, I'm here for you twice a week from now till the end of the year. I've just got a commitment. I'm trying to get an impact here and help as many different people as I can really reestablish their relationship with their health and well-being and be able to get a bit of a foothold of like, oh, I can create a plan for myself to be healthy, to move freely, to do basically what I want with my life as I age. Because the idea that you need to fall apart as you count birthdays is a bit of a myth. And if you're doing the right things at the right time, in the right way, you can have total freedom. And that's what I'm here to help you with. If you ever have any questions or anything like that, just stick some comments underneath these particular episodes, especially if you've got specific questions, or just reach out to me throughout any chat, whatever. I will direct you where I can to make sure you win this game, which is your 100-year plan. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful evening.